Welcome to Stories from Ohio Labor History, an exciting event put on by our North Ohio chapters. My name is Heather Hillenbrand. I am a steering committee member of the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission and an Akron DSA member. I'm very proud to be hosting tonight. Our chapters tonight putting on this fine event are Akron DSA, Mahoning Valley DSA, and Northwest Ohio DSA. And we have some wonderful, wonderful speakers from you. We will have 3 speakers tonight. We have John Tully, we have Thomas Sabatini, and we have Kevin Blair. So I have to give a special warm welcome to John, who is joining us all the way from Australia, where it is actually tomorrow already. Wonderful to have you on this call tonight. And without further ado, I will let you tell a little of our own story of our dear city and our labor history. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Heather, and thanks to the DSA for having me. And it's a great honour, and it's nice to be able to talk to people from Akron, because I really have quite an affinity with the city. I've been there a number of times, and it's quite an important place for me personally. As you know, Northern Ohio, Akron and wider, have a really proud history of working class struggle. And the unfortunate thing is that a lot of it has been forgotten, and it shouldn't be forgotten. Firstly, because it's an inspiration for current generations and future generations, but also I'm going to look at some of the negative lessons we can learn from that too, because we're going to make mistakes all the time, but we don't want to make the same ones again. So yes, the first slide I have here is taken, I think it was Main Street in Akron. I hope I'm saying that right with my Australian accent. Taken in 1913 during the Industrial Workers of the World strike of rubber workers, which brought the city to a standstill, because we're talking about a strike of maybe 25,000, 30,000 people, an enormous number of people at that time. On why we should remember our history, there's a quote, it's actually a quote from George Orwell, but I think it's very relevant to us socialists around the world, that the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. And I wouldn't say there's a conspiracy of the ruling class to make us forget our history, but sometimes it feels that way. I'm not a conspiracist, but certainly that's the effect. When I've been in Akron, I've spoken with people, young people in a bar in particular, and they sort of remembered there was a strike at the Goodyear back in 1936, but they didn't know very much about it. They'd seen that plaque, which is outside the Civic Centre there, but I mentioned some other names, and no, they went right over the top. This is the most boring city in America. They said nothing much has ever happened here. And in actual fact, it's been, one of the very centers of working class struggle. And I really hope that it is again in future. And I sort of recall Heather's words just before about a new contract at Goodyear, about the Starbucks workers struggle and so forth. So the past is there, it's all around us, and it's going to continue. So I've got a couple of photographs here of people, you might know them. We should remember them, we should honor them, and they're both from Northeast Ohio. On the left, we have Sam Levinger. He was a young Jewish boy from Cleveland, and he died fighting for the Spanish Republic in 1937. He was only 20 years old, a member of the Socialist Party and of the Yipsels, I think they called them, the Young Socialists. He died at the siege of Belchite in 1937, September 37. Incidentally, there was also another young socialist, actually a young communist from Akron. His name was Sam Militich. He died in the same siege, the same Battle of Belchite. But today, who remembers Sam Levinger? Incidentally, his niece wrote a very moving book. I don't know if you know the book. It's called Love and Revolutionary Greetings, an Ohio boy in the Spanish Civil War. So he should really be an inspiration for the comrades there today. And he, of course, was a member of the party to which the Democratic Socialists of America have their roots. The other young person there, other beautiful young person, was Solaria Key O'Reilly. She was an Akron nurse who served with the International Brigades in Spain also, and she was wounded when the fascists bombed the hospital where she was working. She was a member of the Communist Party. You can't really see her face there, but she's a formidable woman. Her name was Margaret Purkey. And again, I've spoken to many people in Akron, and they have no recollection that this person ever existed. She was a socialist firebrand. She was a member of the National Committee of the Socialist Party. She was particularly strong on women's rights. She was a strong socialist feminist. She was a powerful speaker. She was an indefatigable organizer, member of the National Committee of the party. So she was not just a local figure, though she was very, very prominent locally. And she was a close friend of Eugene Debs. And I'm sure that everyone knows of Eugene Debs, one of the greats of the American labor movement, both as a unionist, a trade unionist, and also as a socialist agitator. So in 1913, to go back to the strike, the rubber strike, it was at the Firestone plant. It was a huge plant. In one section of the plant, they'd had enough, the workers in there. They had no union, which is something important to remember because the company had kept the union out, the AFL unions and any sort of unions. They walked off the job. They'd had enough of the speed up, the constant speed up, the constant harassment by the foremen and supervisors who looked at everything that they did, the lousy conditions and the lousy pay. They walked off the job and it sort of snowballed from there. It was a completely spontaneous strike, although of course the bosses and their politicians, they said, of course, these workers have been led by the nose by these dangerous red agitators. In fact, the workers went to the dangerous red agitators like Margaret Purkey, and they called on them for help. What do we do? We know that we have to unionize. We know we have to organize. Otherwise, we're going to lose. Even though something by this stage like 25,000 workers had walked off the job in the middle of winter too, or late winter. The AFL was practically on its last legs in the city, and they wouldn't have been much use anyway. And Margaret Purkey's advice was, join the industrial workers of the world. They're an industrial union, they're a militant union, and so they did. I imagine they would have joined any union that would have had them, but they went to the IWW. I'll just step back from that and talk a bit more about the Socialist Party at the time. Of course, and again, just stress that this is where the Democratic Socialists of America have their roots, in the old Socialist Party. In 1913, this was the high watermark of the party. It had a national membership of about 113,000. So you've got a bit of catching up to do to get there. Yet I think that your membership now is about 94, 95,000. So that's a target initially to get to and to overtake it. There were about 7,000 members in Ohio. They published 323 periodicals in a range of languages apart from English, and they probably had 6 million subscribers. They had over 1,000 members, including 56 mayors and a couple of congressmen in the federal Congress, I should say. The Appeal to Reason had, I think, 750,000 subscribers. So it was quite a large circulation. Of course, many, many more people read it than the people that subscribed. Almost half of Akron city councillors were members of the party. Had things continued on that sort of trajectory, I think we could say that they would have taken over the city council, as they did in a number of cities across America. So going back to the strike, they lost the strike. It was a noble failure, and the IWW actually said it was their single greatest mistake that they ever made. They were starved back to work, basically, and this was the deliberate intention of the employers right from the start. They weren't going to negotiate. They weren't going to concede anything. You would come back to work on our terms and we'll weed the militants out. So they were starved back. It was winter. It was a bitter winter. They were running out of coal. They were running out of food. Their kids were basically starving. So a trickle back to work became a flood. They were also sabotaged by the American Federation of Labor, which didn't want the IWW to gain any sort of foothold. Their funds dwindled. The IWW was also running another strike at Patterson in the northeast, a textile workers' strike. So they were split. They were also riddled with spies and provocateurs. This was the deliberate policy of the company. The Socialist Party itself was riddled with spies, and certainly the IWW itself. So whatever the strikers decided, this would go straight back to the bosses. There was brutal repression by state forces and vigilantes, and our forces of law and order in Australia have often been very, very savage with workers in struggle, but in the United States, I have to say it's just appalling what was done, and you'd know as much about that as I do, about the use of the police, the National Guard, etc., against strikers, and this is what they did in Akron too. Also, vigilantes were allowed to roam free, bashing people on the streets, destroying the union's property and such like. So, unfortunately, they had to go back to work, and there was a blacklist of the union militants, and it was another over 20 years before the union movement was able to get another foothold and, in fact, take over, or not take over, to start organising en masse in the strikes that people do know about, such as the 1936 Goodyear strike and the subsequent strikes in Firestone and what have you. So that was a disaster, but coupled with this too, it was a decline of the Socialist Party, both in Akron itself, because there was vicious repression, not only against the strikers, but against the party. It's the Socialist Party. It declined nationally in Ohio and in Akron too. One of the reasons was that in 1917, the United States entered the war that was raging in Europe. And of course, the Socialist Party denounced the war. Here's a picture here of Eugene Debs speaking, denouncing the war. They were bitterly opposed to it, but I think we would have to say that there was a hell of a lot of patriotic fervour in America at the time. We have to support our boys over in Europe. Whereas Debs and the party were saying that the workers of the world have no reason, no interest in going to war against each other. The response of the authorities was to launch what was probably the greatest wave of repression in American history. In 1918, as you probably know, Eugene Debs was sent to prison for 10 years. He was prosecuted under the Espionage Act, which was a complete farce. You can read his Canton speech. That's where he made the speech, his famous anti-war speech. And Margaret Purkey from Akron, incidentally, was chairing the meeting. They didn't arrest her then, they arrested her later, but they arrested Debs at the time under the Espionage Act and 10 years prison, which was a complete farce. And this was the start, as I say, of the most savage repression and a period when the Bill of Rights was just totally trampled underfoot. The right to assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of publication, etc., was just destroyed for the labour movement in the United States. I should say for the left wing of it, because unfortunately Samuel Gompers of the AFL colluded with the authorities against the IWW, the Socialist Party, and any AFL union also, which was waging any sort of militant struggle. This was, of course, was the Red Scare of 1919, it went on to about 1921. And I've got a front cover here of the Cleveland Plain Dealer from 1919, the day after May Day, when the Socialist Party had a rally. And it was perfectly entitled to have a rally, as I say, under the Bill of Rights, the right to freedom of assembly. One of the marchers was killed, 40 were injured, there were 125 arrests. If you look down to the bottom of that page, the Socialist offices were stormed and wrecked by mobs. The police stood by with folded arms, or they sided and actually weighed in against the marchers. So the 125 arrests, they were all of socialist marchers. They were not of the people who were actually committing the violence. Thousands of people across America were arrested. Aliens were deported. Some of them had lived in America since they were little kids, but they'd send them back to Russia or Italy or wherever. As I say, it was the most savage attack. The McCarthyite period after the Second World War was not as savage as the Red Scare. And it's something which is not known about much in the US or in other countries. McCarthyite, of course, has become a staple of the English language, but the Red Scare has largely been forgotten about. And before I forget too, it was accompanied by a wave of lynching of Black people across the United States because the forces of reaction were just allowed to have their head and do whatever they wanted to people like us. And we shouldn't forget that they are capable of doing that. I mean, I shudder to think what would happen if Trump gets back in, for instance, today. I'm sure that they do the same sorts of things. Another reason why the party declined was there was a split, and I think the split was a tragedy myself. There was a three-way split at the 1919 Congress. There were two rival communist parties split off, the Communist Party of America and the Communist Labour Party, and the Socialist Party continued. But none of them ever attained the membership and the influence of the Socialist Party in its heyday. Unquestionably, in my mind, it weakened the movement in so many ways. Unfortunately, Margaret Purkey went with the Communist Labour Party, became a member of the National Committee of that party, but she didn't stick around long. She was used to having a broad, inclusive, multi-tendency party, so a party which was democratic, centralist, Leninist, everything from the top down, was not her cup of tea or coffee, as you would prefer to drink, I think, in America. I think it was a tragedy, and we could see the results of that in Akron, because by 1930, according to the best estimates, the Socialist Party had perhaps 20 members. Remember, it had almost half the city councillors in 1912. The Communist Party, perhaps 75 members, and the Trotskyists, 25 members. And of course, I won't go into this in detail, but the Communist Party had become a complete slavish instrument of Stalin by this time, following whatever twists and turns that he declared they should do, often with really appalling results, labelling the socialists, of course, social fascists and all sorts of other things. I don't want to downplay, actually, the rank and file of the Communist Party members often did heroic things, and I think we should recognise that also. So I began by highlighting the positives, and there are so many positives for us today, for socialists around the world and for socialists in your part of the world, that we shouldn't forget, because it's in our interest to remember, and it's in the interests of future generations to remember, and it's a tremendous inspiration. But I always remember, and it's a cliche, of course, George Santayana's warning that those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And of course, we will make our own mistakes, but we don't want to make the same mistakes as the past. We could have been a lot stronger. And I'm sure that these things, if taken on, and the study of labour history can only strengthen your movement, the Democratic Socialists of America, and socialist organisations such as they are in Australia, are very small today. I should say, though, end on a positive note, that I was delighted to see that Axios poll last year that 70% of millennials in the United States would vote for a socialist. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And I also think it's absolutely fantastic to see the growth of your organisation. So more strength to your arm, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You will be pleased to know that we now have 262 members in the Akron Democratic Socialists of America. So we are at least growing, and we are very excited and appreciative of these words that you've shared with us. I am going to,
I hope to be able to come back and to Akron and speak with you personally.
Oh yes, we would love a visit as soon as you feel it's safe. That would certainly be outstanding. I'm going to hand the floor over to Thomas Sabatini now from Youngstown.
Hello there. So as I was asked to do this and to talk about labor stories from Youngstown, I kind of, I have to admit, I couldn't remove myself from the situation. I had an experience in 2015 of trying to organize in Youngstown. And going back to, well, you know, my dissertation, which brought me back, you know, which was my ancestral home. I'm just struck by how similar the moments were that were in my dissertation from the interwar years, and then you know, just life today. And so just real quick background, I'll try to get through this real quick and get to the interesting stuff. But I worked with United Steelworkers in 2015, and when they were really fresh off of a lot of successes in the greater Pittsburgh area of organizing adjuncts. It was going so swimmingly at YSU that by the end of my contract, I was basically in Pittsburgh helping on those campaigns. In other words, we did not have much success in Youngstown. You know, me and my one other sort of compatriot who joined the effort, who was wonderful, just sat and watched what felt like a real sinking moment. You know, there was the typical aspirational middle class political obsequiousness, I guess I would call it, right? Where you're just not gonna, you know, you get through the professional communities like a turtle. Just do not stick your head out, and that was very much in play amongst adjuncts, I think, just intuitively. It's also a very towny campus. You know, a lot of the people who were adjuncts there, you know, saw themselves as members of a community and not necessarily your sort of typical graduate student, you know, independent scholar who sees themselves as an independent scholar. You know, the fact that we got St. Tressel, which was a football coach who became a national championship coach in not only at YSU, but then later Ohio State, he came back. And all of this sort of, I think, added up to being not an ideal environment. But I remember now in retrospect that this was 1915, and something that we didn't see in our organizational meetings was afoot. I recall sitting around, oh, the arrogance, lamenting the inevitable Clinton presidency and another 4 years of corporate Democrats. And what we walked into, of course, was something very much different. And when I would try to talk about workplace issues in these meetings, I found I found something that was surprising. Most of the people that wanted to talk to me had this colossal rage that I had encountered, I guess, before in my life, but I never really saw it come out. And I was being berated with Fox talking points, and just kind of at this point, I was just not tracking the moment. And then I bring this all up because when I returned to my dissertation to kind of pull some stories out of that I thought would be interesting and maybe instructive, I was just sort of overwhelmed by the parallels of the movement. That union organizing, and so just to be clear, my dissertation was about Youngstown, Mahoning Valley in the interwar years, and the kind of bookended by a labor strike in 1916 that led to the burning down and looting of East Youngstown, and then with the Little Steel strike and the success of industrial unionism on the other end. And throughout that entire time, union politics played out along lines that I would probably best describe them as white identity politics, whether it was temperance or eugenics or efforts at Americanization. These were the cultural wars of their days. And these cultural wars for many workers, I think we need to acknowledge, kind of subsumed questions of human immiseration. They subsumed question of workplace unionization, subsumed questions of solidarity, and made the union struggle in the Mahoning Valley extraordinarily difficult. And as I said, I couldn't help but to be struck by the parallels from my experiences. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just share two stories that to me kind of like really get at this moment. One from the past and from my dissertation, and one that really falls outside the boundaries of it. So the first one actually comes. Well, let me clarify. Okay, I'm sorry. So what are these two things? One is from a book called Bootstraps, by Tom Girdler. And for those of you who do not know, Tom Girdler was the president of Republic Steel in Aliquippa, PA, and known as the Tsar of Little Siberia. And the other one tracks parallel radical unionism in the 50s, 60s, and 70s amongst Black workers and white radicals. And I think if we look at these two kind of moments together, we kind of like get a real good track of what was going on in centered around these questions of white identity politics and unionizing. So as I mentioned, Tom Girdler was called the Tsar of Little Siberia. He, as a matter of fact, kept Eastern and Southern European workers from swimming in the swimming pool, sort of anticipating the post-World War II struggles for desegregation. And really, I think we can look at him as a representative of what political historians call the system of 1896. And 1896 is the moment when sort of Jim Crow is really taking hold in Southern states, rolling back the advance of Black freedom in the South after the Civil War. And out of this system of 1896, Democrats basically get from Republicans what they wanted, which was control of the South and control of Black labor. And Jim Crow without problematic legal issues from the North. But the North got something too. The Dems would sort of defer in national politics, but just as importantly, not cry boo when Jews and Catholics start pouring into the nation. And what that system of 1896 basically created was, in that first, say, fifth of the 20th century, it was a system in which you had racially marginalized labor forces, dominantly immigrant in the North and African American in the South, and that sort of system was agreed to at sort of the political level, and it speaks to the landscape of unionism as it was experienced in the Mahoning Valley in the early 20th century. So, for example, James Musgrove This is a skilled worker that Tom Girdler talks about in his book Bootstraps, and this is during the 1936 Little Steel Strike. And for those of you who do not know, in the 1930s, industrial unionism is won for the first time in the American workplace, most notably with the United Auto Workers sit-down strike in Flint. And it sort of ushers in a period in which, this is the labor movement that brings us the weekend, and that brings us, all those things that we like to think of as the classic labor movements, largesse for American workers. In Big Steel, that is US Steel, they basically gave up and accepted unionization and concentrated their anti-union efforts in Little Steel. And what this meant is in Little Steel in Chicago and other places, especially Youngstown, there's an extraordinarily violent resistance to unionization. And it was really all fought at the lines. The stories that come out of Youngstown at this moment are sort of ridiculous, of biplanes flying in supplies to get around striker lines, and food being mailed to homes to get around strike lines. And these were really highly contested lines that would ultimately end up in violence, bring in the National Guard. And as employers refused to negotiate, the strike itself would sort of fizzle. And Little Steel would only be unionized as a war measure in the early years of World War II. And Girdler's successful, right? And recounting this in his autobiography, Bootstraps, he tells the story of James Musgrove going to work. He's a skilled American workman, and the text is clear, right? He's setting up skilled American workers, or American workers, against these immigrant laborers who are, doing the un-American thing of blocking economic activity. And so, anyways, the workers of the strike line catch James Musgrove. Musgrove's compatriots get away. Girdler tells us, right, in rather cued language, it was being led by Italian. And then in this sort of shocking moment, he retells the treatment of James Musgrove, and fails to really acknowledge a really seismic shift in racial cues. And so this Italian-led strike, a group of strikers, blacken Musgrave's face, like grease, blacken his face, right scab across his chest, and then sort of just drive him home or across town. As Girdler said, the strikers grew bored with beating him, and as if Roman triumph, they paraded him through before the mob. Actually, I think what he meant to mean is fusterium or a gauntlet. But there was Graves, or rather Musgrove, in his underwear and working shoes, grease smeared, sick with pain, made to walk for 3 miles, receiving their curses and jeers with every step, seemingly unaware that blackening somebody's face and threatening lynching is suggesting a completely other racial landscape. Girdler's marking a transition and a new sort of set of conflicts without necessarily even knowing it. It becomes especially interesting when we kind of cast this in a larger context. So if we look at, say, Big Steel, in those communities that were dominated by US Steel, there was relative labor peace along race lines all the way through the 30s. And as a matter of fact, the unions became a place where, many white workers learned solidarity across race lines. But it's also something that Thomas Bell kind of articulates very well in his novel from 1941, Out of This Furnace, that the CIO organizer was a new kind of person. And as he described it, maybe not the kind of American that came over in the Mayflower, or the kind that's always shooting off their mouths about Americanism and patriotism, including some of the goddamnest heels you ever want to see, but the kind that's got made in the USA stamped all over them, from the kind of grub they like to the kind of things they wouldn't do for all the money in the world. And in other words, that system of 1896 had been transformed really from the bottom up, as these immigrants and their children and grandchildren, become a new kind of America, right? Where pizza is now the classic American food, maybe taking the place of the pot roast. But that kind of set the stage for what would happen in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Because there's and I guess a more interesting story, a more how do we say, a chewier story about what would happen in the union struggles of Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley take place if we look at these two parallel tracks of radical unionism in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. On the first track, we can look at the work of some local heroes, Ed Mann and John Barbaro. And these are two unionists, white unionists, who, are how do we say, great proponents of activist unionism, of solidarity unionism. They wanted activist unions based on rank and file solidarity, and stood in contrast to business unionism that was represented by the local union president, Dan Thomas, who kind of famously was caught with two prostitutes whom he insisted were garment union workers. Gives you a little view into what it was that some of the leadership union was interested in. Notoriously with golf clubs engaged in union contracting. So Barbaro and Mann are red baited and fairly ineffective in the 1950s and early 60s. But as the 60s wear on, the red baiting becomes less and less effective. And eventually they win union leadership just by doing the hard work on the ground of being good union stewards and winning disputes on the shop floor, as well as settling proper disputes. And so they win union leadership in 1973. So kind of like filed 1973 in your minds, and then we'll come back to it. Because at the same time, there were efforts by Archie Nelson, Oliver Montgomery, James Davis, and other Black workers to confront discrimination in the hiring and advancement of Black workers. If you do not know, the seniority system in steel was Byzantine and broke down by departments. And so some departments had levels of seniority you can rise up. Other departments were capped, and Black workers found themselves in those capped departments. And when they were in the uncapped departments, they found themselves in labor gangs and in roles of helpers. And when as helpers, they tried to move up the system, what they would encounter was very often sabotage by white workers who would tell them how to do things incorrectly so that they would never really acquire the skills that they needed to move up. And so these folks had some early success in 1960 once they organized their constituents, and a number of Black candidates won leadership positions in the unions, and then only to see white workers, some white workers anyway, responding by race-based organizing of their own directly against Black unionists. Now, this doesn't really take off and win, right? It was Mann and Barbaro who will eventually take control of the union in 1973. But then this something known as the Consent Decree of early 1974 is established. And what this is an intervention to get rid of that seniority system from the federal government, the unions and the companies. And what this meant was that no sooner did Barbaro and Mann get leadership of the union that the consent decree came down and rank and file white union members are seeing this as a direct assault on their years of struggle and hardship. And while Mann and Barbaro were in favor of the consent decree and the new sort of seniority systems, they nonetheless felt obliged on principle, being Democratic Unionists, to hold an election or to hold a vote on the matter. And in a sort of lightly attended meeting, and with a narrow majority, stated its opposition to the consent decree. And you have this, sort of horribly ironic moment where those radicals in the labor, in the union, who finally get control of the union, on grounds that would be, I think, by most people considered awesome, rank and file unionism, direct, immediate opposition to policies that you don't like, direct action, as opposed to going through grievance processes and all that. They look great, but they got caught by this legacy of race and unionism. That's not just race and unionism, it's race in American history. And I guess I have nothing dramatic, no lessons to draw, other than to just acknowledge, that we ignore these sort of cultural issues at our peril. And I think it's something that we need to tune ourselves in union activism to be doing, is not only organizing against bosses along economic lines, but and I'm sure this will find a fairly receptive audience here, but all those issues of white identity politics have to be engaged. I'll just close with one last moment from an oral history project that was conducted in the 80s, I believe, about public housing in Youngstown. And the interviewee is somebody who is being compelled to think about race and public housing in ways that she never thought, sitting down for the interview. And if anybody is an oral historian or a student of Alessandro Potelli, you'll probably be, how do we say, you would not be surprised to see that most of these sort of oral histories kind of reflect what might be called a community memory, right? The same stories, kind of the same images, keep popping up and up. And this was one of those oral histories that's kind of in that line of seemingly tapped into the collective memory as much as personal memory. And all of a sudden she just stops and notices, when she was describing that part of the housing complex was white and part of it was Black, and that the community that it replaced was a mixed community, she pauses and notes, this was the government segregating people. I never thought a thing about it. That was just the way. They lived there, you lived here. We were raised with no prejudice and no one thought a thing about it. And that was in the 1940s. It was only 45 years ago and we were up north. Think all that, and you think all that stuff happens down south. And I just want to close with that, because I just want to suggest that in ways that things might feel obvious to organizers, to ordinary people living their lives, not really interested in labor activism or socialism or deep politics, don't necessarily, how do we say, divine the connection between racial identity politics, or what I'm calling racial identity politics, or America Firstisms, or whatever you want to call it these days, and labor issues. And I just, and I think that was the thing that I kept bumping into in my experience as an adjunct. And I guess that's what I will close on here.
Thank you so much, Thomas. So we learned from John that we shouldn't split our organization 3 ways. I think that's a pretty good one. We're learning from Thomas that sometimes we actually do need to bother with engaging with people if we actually want to organize the multiracial working class, because things are maybe not as obvious as we imagine them to be. And now I can't wait to hear what we're going to learn from Kevin.
Thank you. Give me a second to get my screen set up. Does everyone see the full PowerPoint, or do you see my notes slide as well?
We see the note slide. I think you got to go to the present button. Yeah. There
we go. Because I don't have any notes there, so that's not going to do.
Perfect. You're good now.
Excuse me. My name is Kevin Blair. I'm a member of the Northwest Ohio DSA. That is, I would say our sort of organizing center is Toledo, but we also include comrades from Bowling Green, Findlay, Fremont, most right, but the northwest corner of the state. I'm a longtime socialist and labor organizer. I was a staff labor organizer for almost 20 years and left that role within the last 5. And I've also been very much an amateur historian of anywhere that I lived. And so when I moved to Toledo, I spent lots of time in the local history library room. And one of the great finds was there is a ton of archival information from the 1934 auto light strike, including a lot of interviews or transcripts of interviews. So I've really been able to dive in, and I think it's a historically important strike, but it also brings, I think it lends a couple lessons that we can take from it that are maybe not unique, but present themselves in unique ways. So to start, a little background on the strike. In 1934, right, Toledo was about like every other industrial and industrializing town in this part of the Midwest. There was an existing labor movement that was almost entirely in the crafts. And it had been around for quite some time. Back when Toledo had a large Socialist Party presence, many of the unions and union leadership were close with the Socialist Party, but with World War I and the split, that tended to not be the case anymore. Toledo was also quickly by this time becoming a hub of auto parts manufacturing for the big auto manufacturers in Michigan, which is still one of the major industries in Toledo today. Of course, we're also in 1934, we are in the height of the Great Depression. So there's massive unemployment, houselessness, hunger, and Toledo's no exception. This is a picture of along the riverfront, just north of downtown Toledo, and I felt this picture really speaks to the conditions. And if you've ever been here and know this part of town, I mean, this is one of the last places you would even build a shack, because every spring that water goes almost halfway up the bank, the second bank behind the shacks. So it speaks a lot to the desperation. But in this atmosphere, and some background before we get to the auto light strike itself, there had been organizing around the country for relief for unemployed workers. And this took the there were two major organizations. One was the Unemployed Citizens Councils that were loosely affiliated with the Communist Party USA. And there was a second smaller group of unemployed citizens leagues that was associated with the American Workers' Party, which was a small, relatively new socialist party led by A.J. Musty. For folks in the movement a long time, that's a name that comes up quite a lot in a lot of different contexts. And they founded themselves as they wanted to be they wanted to distinguish themselves from the Stalinism of the Communist Party, but ultimately we're a fairly small group but effective. And a few years prior to 1934, they had sent a couple of organizers to Toledo and a few other towns in Ohio. They were active in Columbus as well, to start organizing unemployed workers, to start an unemployed league. And they went on to found the Lucas County Unemployed League, who primarily engaged in fighting for extension of unemployment reliefs, direct food aid. My favorite story from the Unemployed League is that the new mayor had cut off direct food aid. And so about 20 members of the Unemployed League happened to catch wind of where the mayor was having breakfast. And so they all went there the same time as the mayor, and they sat down, and when someone asked them about the tab, they said, "Oh, this is on the mayor." And of course the mayor refused to pay the bill and got mad, and they wouldn't pay the bill. They just kept sending it to the mayor's office, which ultimately led to the mayor reinstating direct food aid. So these were a group of workers who were taking action. They were learning how to get things done. They were learning how to win. So while this is going on, a group of workers at the Toledo Autolite factory in 1933, and Autolite manufactured spark plugs. That went to the big automakers in Michigan. And in 1933, a group of workers approached the Central Labor Union, what we would today call the Central Labor Council. And they told them that they had heard that the AFL was interested in launching an organizing drive. They wanted to be part of it. They wanted to organize their workplace. And after some conversations and a couple meetings, the organizers of the AFL told them, "We don't believe that you have the support you need to win an organizing campaign right now. We think you need to spend some more time with your coworkers, and we can revisit this in a year or so." And they were really persistent, and eventually they got the AFL to reluctantly support them. And so they organized a strike for recognition. Mind you, there's several thousand people working at the Autolite plant. So in 1933, they go on strike. All 15 of them in their one department, and the whole plant went on strike. Needless to say, it was obviously right away this was not going to be a winning strike. The company just fired them. Didn't even put up a pretense. They immediately changed their demands from union recognition just to reinstatement. And they built some support from the other unions. The company ended up agreeing to reinstate them at their old jobs. Now, this all happens in the course of about 6 weeks in 1933. Oh, by February of 1934, their coworkers who saw that, these guys got fired, but they got their jobs back. Maybe this union idea isn't as risky as we thought it was. And of course, they put in, I think it was probably a wake up for them that, when the organizer told them they needed to build more support, they might have known what they were talking about. And so they seem to have put the work in So in February of 1934, they announced another strike at Autolite and shut the place down. Almost everybody participates in the strike this time. And the demands were what you would expect from the time. It was a reduction in working hours, an increase in hourly pay, union recognition, some safety measures. I believe paid vacation was one of their demands, and seniority rights. The company didn't make any move to recognize the union or negotiate, but neither at first did they make any attempt to operate the facility. They took the position they would wait the strikers out. For February and March and even into a good part of April, this is pretty uneventful. This was the story up to that point. I mean, they maintained pickets. The plant stayed closed. It didn't appear either side, that any side was close to reaching any kind of a resolution. Towards the end of April, the company sought an injunction to limit the number of picketers. Up to this point, it's also worth noting, up to this point, the mayor of Toledo at the time, who replaced the guy who cut the direct food aid, and was elected took office at the beginning of 1934. Anderson was the shortest lived Toledo mayor in the history of the city, because they voted to, in the same election they elected him, they voted to discontinue the office of mayor at the end of the next calendar year. So he got 1 year. But he had been a former close associate of the Socialist Party and had actually represented them as counsel back in the teens. And he had no interest in causing trouble with the picket line. So he actually instructed the police to just leave him alone. Which for the most part they did. However, the sheriff's deputies took a very different approach. And they had continually shown up and harassed. It hadn't been terribly serious, but they would harass the pickets. But eventually the company seeks an injunction. And once word gets out, the Unemployed League, the Lucas County Unemployed League, starts sending their members to join the picket lines to beef up the size of the picket lines. So in May, on May 7th, a judge, Judge Stewart, whose name will come up again, issued an injunction limiting the pickets, I believe it was to 5 pickets per gate at the facility. The union leadership, I think, figured, well, we've got an injunction, what can we do? The Lucas County Unemployed League sent a letter to the judge and said, with full knowledge of the principles involved and the possible consequences, we openly and publicly violate an injunction, which we believe is suppressive and oppressive act against all workers. So not only did they violate the injunction, they sent a letter to the judge telling him they were going to do it, beforehand. So the Lucas County Unemployed League essentially at this point takes over picketing. And these are by no means massive pickets. We're talking 12, 15, at most 30 pickets at the plant, but it was more than the injunction allowed. So the sheriff's deputies would come and they would arrest, the picketers for violating the injunction. And they would take them downtown, and the court system worked a little more quickly back then, apparently, because they'd get a hearing the same afternoon, almost always in front of Judge Stewart. And they would sing and they would chant and they would just have themselves a merry old time. And they would get cleared of any charges. They'd leave the courthouse and they go right back to the Autolite plant and rejoin the picket lines. This goes on for about a week and a half. You know, and in some of the accounts from the time, I mean, even from people on both sides, they kind of say it just kind of turned into the game that we played every day. But then a big piece of news circulated that changed the tone entirely. And that was that Autolite intended to reopen and that they had recruited scabs from out of town to come operate the plant, which resulted in significant increased numbers of pickets at the plant. And of course, as information comes out, when they found out the night that they planned, because of course they planned to transport the scabs across the picket line in the dark of night. But word got around they were planning to do this, and 7,000 people showed up to picket at the facility. The sheriff's deputies tried to break it up, busted some heads. Which ended up leading to basically led to an open fight between the picketers, the sheriff on one side, and the sheriff's deputies and the security that Autolite had hired. Over the course of the night, the picketers had forced all of Autolite's security and the sheriff's deputies into the plant. They barricaded themselves in the plant. The workers attempted to storm the plant 3 times and never quite got through the gate. The sheriff's deputies and plant security, which everyone now learns has hoarded tear gas and vomit gas inside the plant, starts firing tear gas and vomit gas at the strikers from the roof of the factory, which of course workers, as much as they can, just start throwing them back inside the factory. And obviously, right, I mean, we start to get some casualties. Amazingly, only one person lost their life that night, one of the strikers. But a number of sheriff's deputies, a number of picketers were injured, a few severely so. In response, the governor, of course, calls in the National Guard. The National Guard succeeds in dispersing the strikers enough for the sheriff's deputies and plant security to get out of the facility, but not enough to break up the picket lines entirely. And so for the next several days, a running battle between the picketers and the National Guard goes on. It's interesting to note the National Guard unit was from Fremont. This is now the end of May. Large numbers of the people in the Guard unit were actually missing their high school graduation because they had been called up to guard duty to break up the strike. So these are kids. And a lot of the reports were that, you know, it was clear they didn't want to be there, which is typical. And this spills into the neighborhoods around the plant. Interestingly, at the same time, several of the neighbors who had no involvement in the strike, in fact, accounts from people who lived in the neighborhoods around the strike, had basically said they weren't involved at all. They didn't identify with the strikers in any way or with the company. They just saw it as something happening down the street until all this tear gas and vomit gas starts drifting into their neighborhood. And they actually demanded that the owner of the factory be arrested for using all of these hazardous chemicals in their neighborhood. The same Judge Stewart who issued the injunction ordered an arrest warrant for the owner of the company for firing the tear gas, which I always thought was a humorous point in the story. Eventually, this turns into a standstill. It's clear that neither the National Guard is going to win the picket. Meanwhile, as all this is going on, the Central Labor Union has been meeting to debate calling a general strike in support of the auto labor workers. Some unions had enthusiastically backed the idea from the beginning. Some had opposed it adamantly. They were concerned about violating the injunction, or didn't want to get involved in what was at this point a violent and dangerous situation. And so in this moment of, it seemed as though the Central Labor Union was going to vote, I believe, a fourth time for a general strike, and it appeared they had the votes to support it. This is the same time as the fight with the National Guard starts. The president of the company gets arrested. Residents of the town start siding with the strikers. And the Unemployed League, right, is all out at this point. The Unemployed League is, of the 7,000 strikers there that night and the 10,000 strikers there the next day when the Guard arrived, the vast majority of them were either members or associates of the Unemployed League. In fact, many more of them than there were actual workers from the plant. It's at this point that the company makes the reasonable decision that, I'm sure with pressure from other employers, that maybe we should try a different way to resolve this. It ends up leading to negotiations, a quick agreement to continue negotiations and end the strike. At one point, a few months later, the workers did have to go back out on strike for like 2 days, as the company didn't live up to one promise, but quickly did. But all these workers, both union members in the facilities, unemployed workers, and other folks who were involved in this, went on to play huge roles in the future of the city. A lot of them were key organizers in the strike and organizing drive at the Chevrolet parts plant in 1935, the next year. And went on to be a founding local of the United Auto Workers, which was founded in 1936. The local that went on to be started, which is now UAW Local 12, is still the largest and one of the largest and most influential locals in the city, and is sort of by custom the leader of the, when people ask, what's the labor movement thinking? Right, they talk to local, they talk to someone at Local 12. But obviously this militant tradition didn't continue. The unemployed leagues had some success for the coming years, as unemployment reduced when the war started. Right, the need for that organizing it became less and less urgent. But I want to hit a couple points that I think are takeaways as lessons. And one is the need for organized socialist leadership. So it was the leadership of the American Workers' Party through their work in the Unemployed League, who were very much in the background of this, right? These were not public figures, but they very much played a guiding role in shaping the decisions to ignore injunctions, right, and to not trust the courts and not trust federal mediators and the like to resolve the strike. The second was it really exposed the limitations of the formal leadership of the labor unions at the time. And I think that's a limitation which continues to this day and has changed very little. For them to consider thinking about a general strike in support of their brothers and sisters, it took Right? I mean, it took 10,000 people in a fight with the National Guard for them to get to the point they were willing to join the fight. And they should have been there weeks, if not months ahead of that. And the final is that the ongoing political work of the organized socialists played a huge role in this, right? The American Workers' Party didn't show up at the beginning of 1934 after the strike and start doing political work. They not only they engaged in political education work, but they had taught unemployed workers how to fight and how to win fights. And so when this new bigger fight came up, they were the ones who knew how to win the fight, right? And so they brought that to the labor movement, who I think even I have a hard time believing that some in the organized labor movement knew very well what it took to win a strike, but didn't have the political will to do it. So on that note, I will wrap up. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, Kevin, so much. I will always be out here saying that an organized socialist movement is essential for a fighting labor movement. So I think that's a great lesson. We now have time for some questions if our speakers will stay with us. I know we went a little over, but everyone was so wonderful. I didn't feel like it was long at all. So if you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat or raise your hand, whatever you feel better about. I guess I should have come up with a question to lead. Yeah, these were all wonderful stories. Some I've heard before, some are a bit new. That the gauntlet for the scabs story is pretty good. Perhaps an exciting tradition in Northern Ohio. Yeah. Oh, question for John. What brought the Akron strike to your attention? Why Akron?
It's a long story, but some time ago I wasn't always a professor. I worked in heavy industry, and I worked for Goodyear in Melbourne, or I was sent into the plant. And it was the filthiest job I'd ever done. It was taking apart the Banbury mixer. And going home, I thought, I don't know anything about rubber. It's an essential commodity, but I don't know very much. Maybe there's room for a book in this to examine rubber as a commodity. So I started to think about that. And years later, after I'd done my PhD, I did some work on rubber plantations in French Indochina, because I was a professor, I suppose, of colonial history. And so then I thought I'll write a book about this, and it became a book called The Devil's Milk, A Social History of Rubber. There was actually a series of plays put on in Akron a little while back with the same name, and they were based roughly on the book. So I had to come to Akron, of course, and I wandered around the place and I did more and more research. And so after a while, I thought when that book had been published, I should write a book about the labour history of Akron, which I did. So that's the way that I came to do it. It's a sort of a roundabout thing from a couple of decades ago, which brought me to Akron and start writing about the labour history of your city.
Thank you so much. And the story about the rubber work being a dirty job is definitely a point well taken here. We have stories about women who would hose their husbands off in the street after they came home from work before letting them in the house, which, something that we all perhaps think about doing, but was a very practical concern for some of these workers. I've got Mike with his hand up here. Do you have a question, Mike?
He's struggling to unmute.
Okay.
Hang on.
I'll give him a second.
Yeah, hi. I had a question for everybody, actually. I just wanted, in a few words, what do you think is the biggest struggle or the biggest obstacle to labor currently and going forward is, nationally and internationally? Did everybody hear that?
I'm going to start off actually, and then I'm going to let the panelists go through in the same order because that just makes sense to me. Sorry to girl boss it, but I think the biggest struggle we have today in this country is a lack of awareness of labor in general. So few people in the recent strike support work I've been doing have had any direct experience with militant labor and or with the strike, and the complexities of union organizing have been very far removed from a lot of workers for a long time. So I think it is our duty as socialists to continue in our labor education events, partially because so few people feel this connection. Hopefully a few more of you feel some connection tonight after hearing some stories about our area, because I know that a lot of it does seem distant, but it's actually very close to us. I'll give it off to John.
Yes, Australia used to have 65% of the workforce unionised. That was in 1945. Today, it's below 20%. So organised labour has never been as weak, at least in the last 100 years, as it is now in Australia. And I think that's the same all the way around the world. And so just to add to what you've said, I'd say that we've had decades of neoliberalism. I think you call it neoliberalism in the US as well as here. And the old traditions of solidarity and cooperation, it's gone out the window. And you've got, it's been replaced by this individualism, looking at things not in the collective way that socialists do. So I think that we've got a real fight on our hands. I know that a lot of my students, the first year students, they never used to even know what left and right were in politics. These were alien concepts. And the fact that, they had these unions, what do you want these unions for? Even though the neoliberalism was hacking away at their living conditions, at their wages, etc. I think, well, they've won that temporarily, the neoliberals. But that's a big fight that we've got to have to re-establish, that we do things together, that we cooperate, that we fight back against that pernicious ideology.
I guess I'd follow John, that solidarity is the key. I mean, it's there, that's nothing new. I guess the difficulty for me is that neoliberalism has done a great job of playing three-card Monte with the means of production. And if we notice all the stories tonight, there's something that they have in common, and that's that you could actually seize the means of production. In other words, if you sit down in an auto plant, you can just break everything when they come in to get you. I mean, that is a tactic that labor does not have these days, and at least not at the national or local level. I mean, and so if we're going to be talking about solidarity along that would look like. That would create movements that would be able to seize the means of production like we did in the 30s. That must be an international movement. I mean, and so I guess if we acknowledge that, I guess this was a bit of where I was coming from with labor movements have to be social movements as well. I don't think that distinction is real anymore because, like I said, where's the means of production? How do you even get to it? And that's my bit.
So to take a somewhat different, to take a bit of a different answer, we have it is a crisis of leadership, and more specifically, it's a lack of independent class struggle leadership. Our formal existing leadership in the trade unions is and has been. I mean, this hasn't changed since the 1930s. Take a primarily class collaborationist approach. They are more, in the United States at least, they are more closely tied to bourgeois capitalist political parties than ever before. And the people who should be, those of us in the socialist movement who can fill the missing role of leadership, are often either not are either not organized, not developed, or just not in the position to exercise that leadership. There are obviously some exceptions, like yourself, Heather, who's very active in your union. But yeah, I think that it is a crisis of leadership, and figuring out how to fill that leadership role in a way that isn't. I feel like for the last 30 years, and I mean 40 years, and I was a union staffer, that this was the idea. Oh, I'm going to get a job as a union staffer, and then I'll change the union that way, and it doesn't work. You either give up your independent socialist politics, or you end up doing what you can until you can't, and you have to leave.
Could I just add one thing? I completely agree with that. One thing I should have mentioned, I think, is that we need international trade unions, and I don't mean just Canada and the United States, good though that is, because capital is footloose and fancy-free. It goes wherever it wants in the world. In the case of Akron, they started to talk about decentralization because they didn't like the wages and conditions that the new industrial union, the URW, had won. So they went to the South, which was non-unionized and which was totally split, along racial lines. The racism was incredible. And of course, after that, they moved offshore completely. And what do? They workers demand better conditions in one place. They move to China. They move to another place. It's a thing that goes back 100 years at least, but it's something, and it goes back to, we do need a new leadership in trade unions, as our comrade was saying, and part of that would be to have an international perspective and not a nationalist perspective, because it's a dead end.
That's so true, and something that we are seeing every day, even in the more militant strikes that we saw recently this fall. Unfortunately, a lot of the messaging from the union leadership was about this work is being done by people in Mexico and therefore it's unsafe. The actual rank and file that I talked to, I don't felt particularly that Mexico was the enemy. I think that they felt like Kellogg's was the enemy. Based on the way Kellogg's had been abusing them and the way that Kellogg's was willing to outsource their labor. So I do think that, well, obviously, and as Thomas has described, there are a lot of issues with culture everywhere. This isn't unique to America, but I think in Ohio, we see an awful lot of exciting and frightening ones. But we need to be able to move past this and encourage solidarity by our relationships with other workers, because simply prescribing let's all get along certainly isn't going to work. Do I have more questions? All right, well, I think that if you're a worker, you should think about how you can organize in your workplace. I think that this has been an awesome event, and I really appreciate everyone so much being here. I hope that John will come and visit us in Akron soon. Anytime, you're welcome. And I think that we may see Kevin and Thomas a bit sooner. Hopefully we will be going to a labor history museum in Youngstown sometime in the next couple months. So maybe we could join you then. And Kevin, of course, always welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. This was a wonderful and exciting and inspiring event. And so thankful for my comrades in Akron DSA, in Northwest Ohio DSA, and Mahoning Valley DSA. Solidarity, keep up the good work. Thank you so much.